Welcome to the show. So I really take for granted my freedom to move. I take for granted my right to get in my car and go across town or go across the country. These are all things that I consider part of my right as an American. And they are things that were routinely denied to the African Americans who came before me. In fact, efforts to limit and circumscribe Black movement, to keep us in our place, our geographical places, they were really key and foundational to efforts to circumscribe Black people more generally. In the PBS film Driving While Black, Race, Space, and Mobility in America, co-directed by Dr. Gretchen Sorin and Rick Burns. The film explores the story of Black movement, the way that Black people broke past the limitations that others attempted to put on them. And it talks about how we really created new communities and new places because African Americans, like everybody else, insisted on making this American country live up to this American idea. The film, Driving While Black, co-directed by Dr. Gretchen Sorin and Rick Burns, explores a subject that Dr. Sorin, of course, also discusses in her book, Driving While Black. Here I am with Dr. Gretchen Sorin. Welcome to the podcast, Gretchen Sorin. Gretchen is a distinguished professor and the director of the Cooperstown Graduate Program of the State University of New York. She recently co-wrote and co-directed a new film, Driving While Black. Welcome to the program, Gretchen. And one of the things, the way I would best describe your movie is that it's a story about how important mobility has been to Black people in America, and also about how limiting that mobility has really been at the core of racism in America. Can you tell me if that's a fair description, or expound if you would like?
I think that's a great description, and I would only add that the role of the automobile comes into play in the 20th century, and it's so important to the way that African Americans felt about mobility and the way they were able to use mobility and use independence to better their lives and to avoid Jim Crow.
You start with, you talk a lot about Reconstruction, which was a moment in American history post-Civil War where African Americans had this new freedom, and with it came the freedom to leave the plantation and go strike out and make your way elsewhere. But it wasn't straightforward, because for lots of Black folks, they really didn't know where else to go. I mean, slavery was the system that they knew, that we knew.
Right, and so many people had been restricted to their plantations for generations. They had never left maybe a 1 mile stretch of land. They had never been anywhere. They couldn't read, they couldn't write. They didn't know anything other than how to pick cotton. And it was impossible for them to think about leaving. And so even with my own family, I looked at the folks in South Carolina where my father's family was from, and they never left that area. They stayed even after slavery ended. And we might ask why didn't they go? But where would they go? They knew nothing. They couldn't read. They couldn't write. They had no resources, and they had no money.
How important was the automobile to, for instance, the Great Migration, which you also talk about in the movie? So many African Americans, we are descended from folks in the South. You mentioned your family's from South Carolina. My mother's family is originally from Mississippi. Like so many other African Americans, my ancestors, my grandfather moved from Mississippi to Kansas, into the Midwest. And you talk about that. And you talk about how a lot of that movement was about fleeing racial terrorism. How important was it for Black folks to be able to pick up, get in their cars, and get out of town during this moment in history?
Well, you know, what I discovered in my research was that every African American who could buy a car bought a car. And we bought cars in large numbers. And if we couldn't buy a new car, if you couldn't afford to buy a new car, you bought a used car, or you bought a used truck. And I think that that demonstrates how important the automobile was. If you think about what it was like to ride on the Jim Crow bus, or ride in the Jim Crow car of a train, or ride on a Jim Crow trolley car, public transportation was segregated. And on segregated transportation, that was filthy, rarely cleaned. You had to sit in the back of the bus or the filthy train car right behind the engine of the train. The bus drivers often carried guns, and they would enforce segregation with their guns. There are so many instances in the paper of people being shot by bus drivers. There are instances of bus drivers requiring Black people to get on in the front and telling them, okay, now you go and you go get on the back door. And when they'd go to the back door, the bus would pull away. The cruelty, the humiliation, the disgust with which African Americans were treated. And one of the things that was truly upsetting was that African American children faced this. And so you can imagine how that humiliation is just passed down generation to generation, the inferiority that Black children felt and their parents didn't want them to feel. So in comes the automobile in the 30s, 40s, 50s. And all of a sudden, you can travel in your own private space. You don't have to face that humiliation. You don't have to put your children through that. So the automobile is incredibly important in giving dignity to African Americans, in destroying that humiliation that we felt in getting onto the public conveyances. It was incredibly important. But I think also you couldn't have had the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s without the automobile. The automobile made the civil rights movement happen.
And the car, as you describe it, really was this sanctuary from these indignities that you talk about. You know, it's so interesting, Gretchen, because right now we're in a climate where so much, we have so much conflict in this country over the right to be left alone. And it seems that when, when African Americans come into play, when we're at issue, it's kind of like the inverse, whereas normally the presumption is it's my right to be left alone. Why are you in my business? Where Black people are involved, it becomes an issue of our having to prove that we belong wherever it is we happen to be. If it's in the White House, show me your birth certificate. If you're bird watching in the park or jogging down the street, tell me what you're doing and why you're in my neighborhood. Your movie explores really powerfully some of the historical antecedents for that. You started to talk just now about bus drivers shooting Black people who didn't sit in the right place. But you also touch upon, and I'm not going to ask people, I don't want you to give the movie away because I do want people to see it, but you really do touch on other times when Black people were just policed and regulated for trying to move around, for trying to go from one place to another. Tell us a little bit about that, if you would.
Well, one of the revelations for me as I started doing the research for my book, which the film is based on my book, also called Driving While Black. And in doing that research, I discovered that the antecedents of modern police departments were slave catchers. The very first police departments in this country were the good citizens of various communities who legally got together every night and policed the community. They walked through the community looking for escaped slaves. And they were not there just to check on passes, because if you were an enslaved person, you had to have a pass to go from one place to another. You had to prove that you were supposed to be there. But not only were they there to check passes, they were there to intimidate. They were there to make sure there were no slave insurrections. They were there to make sure that enslaved people didn't get together, didn't gather together and possibly plot something against the white community so that they could get out of slavery. So these are the antecedents that we're looking at. And these were legal groups. But if you think about what happens during the civil rights movement, these legal groups become police departments that are enforcing segregation in the South. They're enforcing this humiliation that we're talking about. And then we also start to get these extra legal groups, the Klan, who are going around and they're enforcing intimidation on Black communities. The goal there was both to intimidate and require deference, but also to keep Black people in the South. They did not want Black people to leave the South because that was the labor force. And so they would patrol train stations and they would patrol bus stations to make sure that the labor force was not leaving to go north. A lot of people, when they were able, relatives would come north in their cars, and under cover of darkness, they would take other people north in those cars so that they could sneak out of the South.
And we're talking about, this is post-Reconstruction in the 20th century. We're talking mid-20th century. Yes. Folks having to sneak out of their homes in the South to go somewhere else, sneaking around because of racism and the fear of violence.
Yes. Because when slavery is ended, slavery is reinstituted as in a way that is basically that keeps people on the land. Right? It's sharecropping. It's called sharecropping, but it's really another form of legalized slavery.
Another thing that your film explores really well is just sort of the history and culture of travel and how, you look at, because I love old movies, I love watching these vintage shows, and you always see the family packing up and the station wagon, and they go drive to the Grand Canyon, or the Brady's went everywhere. They could take a road trip anywhere. You talk about how the stress and drama of Black folks going on a road trip. And the downside of that is something that we're all too familiar with. The terrorism, the torture, the indignity, even being in your car and being harassed, driving into, I think it's in Greenville, where the city sign says, the blackest land, the whitest people. So, even within the protection of the car, you had these indignities, but you also had the drama of figuring out where you were going to get gas, where you were going to eat, where you were going to go to the bathroom. And you talk about how there was so much Black entrepreneurialism that stepped in and filled the gap. Tell us a little bit about that, because that was something in your film that I found really hopeful and optimistic. The way that Black folks found and created opportunity out of some of these indignities.
Absolutely. And Black folks wanted to travel just as white folks wanted to travel. They wanted to see the Grand Canyon. They wanted to go to monuments. They wanted to go to museums. They wanted to educate their children about the country. And we were proud of this country. We were part of this country. We built this country. And so as African Americans travel, they need places to stay. They need places to eat. They need places to go to the bathroom and get gasoline. And that's where this incredible network of restaurants, roadhouses, hotels, motels grows up around this travel industry for African Americans. And it really begins after the Depression because the federal government is encouraging Black people to travel. And Black people can't stay at the Hilton or the Holiday Inn or Howard Johnson's. They can only stay at Black-owned and Black-operated and all Black businesses. And so you have this incredible network across the country, primarily from the Mississippi East, and then you have a lot of them on the West Coast, not so many in the Midwest, west of Chicago, but you do have some. And this network is getting national marketing through all of the travel guides that African American publishers put together to notify people. And one of them, of course, is the Green Book. That's the one that everyone knows about. But there are dozens of these guides. There's Travel Guide, Grayson's Guide, Small's Guide. There are literally dozens of these guidebooks that no longer exist, that tell you where you can find a welcoming face and a smile when you stop along the roadside, where you can stop to eat, where you can stop to go to the bathroom, where you can get gasoline.
Speaking of gasoline, another interesting little tidbit that I picked up from your film, and I should remember, folks, Driving While Black, based on Gretchen Sorin's book of the same name, Driving While Black. In the film, you talk about these other entrepreneurial opportunities that arose for Black people. Gas stations. I had no idea that there were, Black folks owning Esso gas stations. I think you said that that was one of the few companies that had Black franchisees. Black franchisees would put the green book out so you could stop at you could get gas station from a Black family could get gas from a Black gas station owner, buy their green book, and then figure out where they could eat and sleep on the road. We hear a lot about the dark side of Jim Crow, which I'm saying that wrongly. I think Jim Crow only has a dark side. And frankly, a lot of people, I don't know that we have yet really grappled with the racism of this century and the last. But one of the things that was hopeful to me was how, even in the midst of all of that darkness, even in the midst of all that oppression, you had Black people finding ways to create opportunity. It wasn't, they created opportunity. They didn't just say, we can't do this. They figured out, okay, well, you won't let us do A, we're going to figure out how to do B. And it really is a remarkable story about creativity and ingenuity, I think.
And I think you see that really white folks were unaware that there was really a parallel world out there. And that parallel world was the Black world. And white people were totally unaware of all of these businesses that African Americans had started to support their fellow African Americans when they traveled. And also within communities. And there are a couple of interesting stories, I think. First of all, many of these people that owned these businesses supported the civil rights movement financially. They had the wherewithal to put some money. Somebody said to me the other day, well, where did the money come from for the civil rights movement? Well, yes, it came from wealthy white liberals, but it also came from Black entrepreneurs that owned businesses, and they supported the civil rights movement as well. And that money for the civil rights movement also came from women. A lot of women fried chicken, made coconut pies, coconut cakes, and apple pies and sweet potato pies, and they sold that food. And they took that money and they used that money, they donated that money, and they made surprising amounts of money, donated that to the movement. Very often they were selling that food to white people who had no idea that that money was going right into the civil rights movement. They were people that just loved that food and wanted to buy that food. And they would never have purchased it if they knew where the money was going. But the money went right into the movement. They
had no idea that pineapple upside down cake was buying somebody's freedom. That was paying for somebody's bail. But, and the interesting thing about mobility is that if you look at the legal basis for the Civil Rights Act, for instance, it's predicated on the Commerce Clause. It's predicated on the fact that these barriers to Black people moving from state to state were really a burden on interstate commerce. I mean, a lot of people think that we have a Civil Rights Act because a bunch of people in the legislature said, it is wrong to treat Black and brown people differently. No, we have a Civil Rights Act because they said it's bad for business in order to have these barriers to interstate commerce, which is, I think, kind of an interesting nugget. Why did you write your book, and why did you feel the need to tell this story in the way that you did? Because you tell so much of the story of the Black experience in America in this film, which is about cars and mobility, but you can't really get to the significance of the car until you tell the story about how we were living before the car. What was your motivation in telling this story right now?
I started this story with the Green Book. I started because someone had handed me the cover of a Green Book and said, "Have you ever heard of this?" And I said, "I've never heard of it." And I was curious. As a student of African American history, I had never heard of this Green Book, and I thought, how is that possible? Excuse me. So I started looking at the Green Book, and usually when you're working on a PhD, as you go up in education, you get more and more narrow. But I started this as my dissertation. So I started this more than 20 years ago.
Wow.
And as I went into the story, it got wider and wider and wider. And it started out as just a story about the Green Book. But I realized, the Green Book is important, but there's a much bigger story here. And that story is, well, first I got to the automobile. That story is about the automobile and how the automobile changed African American life. And then I even got to a bigger story, which was this is a story that's even bigger than the automobile. It's a story about mobility. And what does mobility mean in a free society? And I started looking at the legal aspects of mobility. Mobility was so important in the 18th century, doesn't even make it into the Constitution. It was assumed to be a right. It makes it into the Articles of Confederation, but never even into the Constitution. We just assumed that in a free society, everyone has the freedom of mobility. But of course, enslaved people are brought here, and for them, mobility is denied. So to understand why mobility becomes so important for Black people, you have to look at how it was first denied. So when all of a sudden we can go where we want to go, when we want to go, that's enormous. That's an enormous change in freedom, and so important for African Americans that I thought this is really the story that I need to tell. And it just became fortuitous, sadly, because of the cell phone. We're starting to be able to see the prejudice that Black people knew was there all the time. Now white people can see it because of cell phones. We see the murder of George Floyd. We see the murder of Philando Castile. We see the murder of all of these Black men.
And you see it when you consider these deaths in the context of the history that you tell in your movie. So they become all the more tragic and all the more potent. Like I couldn't stop thinking about, frankly, any one of a number of the people who you mentioned and who are also mentioned in the movie. But, you just think about young Trayvon Martin walking down the street, and Trayvon Martin, all these other folks who were simply exercising the freedom that so many people have and take for granted to go from point A to point B without having someone in their business. That freedom from having people in your business is a freedom that Black people too often don't enjoy. Your film comes full circle, and you talk a lot about, you talk about the conversation that we're now having about Black people and policing and law enforcement. You also said that you feel that this is a moment now that white people are beginning to care. Is that because of the cell phone, or do you think that there's some other global consciousness happening?
I think it's because of the confluence of COVID-19 and the murder of George Floyd. I think that people started paying attention because they were home and paying attention. And there was nothing else to do this summer. And people were kind of laser focused on what was going on in the news. And I think that was kind of key to, so COVID-19, I think, was really key to getting people focused in on what was happening. And then the murder of George Floyd happens, and all of a sudden we start to have demonstrations. It was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. And people were able to go out into the streets, because they weren't working. I think really those things, it happened at just sadly, it happened at that moment. And then Ahmaud Arbery was murdered for jogging in the neighborhood. And Breonna Taylor was murdered asleep in her bed or just in her bed. And I think white people started to notice that, wow, we're murdering Black people in a horrible, horrible way for no reason.
You touch upon being a mother and a grandmother in the movie. How afraid are you or were you when your kids were younger? How nervous were you just sending your kids out on the street?
I think when my son was in high school, I was terrified. Because he was the sweet kid who would be driving around. He had a car, even though it wasn't a sports car. It was a little Toyota. He had his grandmother's car, but he would be driving around with a car full of white girls because we live in a rural area and there aren't very many African Americans. So here he's driving around with his friends, and I was terrified. But I don't want to scare him and make him afraid to have friends. At the same time, it was a scary time for us. I would say, if you are stopped, here's what you must do. A car full of teenagers is not something that, is something that is really frightening often to police officers. They're afraid of the people in the cars. And because they're afraid, you have to be afraid that they might be so nervous that they'll shoot you if you make a wrong move.
I don't have children, and I'm so fascinated by what you just said because it really speaks to the need to strike a balance when you are trying to protect a young person from the fear or the violence of somebody who legally has a gun, but you also don't want them to go through the world scared and nervous and with a sense of not belonging. Something else, Gretchen, that really struck me when I was watching your movie, and I said this, it sounds so cliched, but I was watching it and I said to my husband, I was like, meaning me very personally, I am like so many of us in this generation, we are the living embodiment of our ancestors' dreams. We can walk around, do things, say things, engage with folks in a way that our parents, grandparents, and greats could not. That has to be balanced with the very real reality that so many people have when they are assaulted and molested for simply jogging down the street and minding their business. How do you, as a parent and grandparent, strike that balance when you're talking to young people?
It's interesting. I had this conversation with my daughter recently, who has a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, little girls. And there was a film out, a very short film, I guess it appeared on Instagram, of parents talking to their children about this very subject. And one of the, it would make you cry because you see this little girl and she puts her hands up. She's practicing. Her father is teaching her what to do. And she puts her hands up and she says, "My name is Ariel. I'm 8 years old and I do not have a weapon." And she's just this cute little 8-year-old girl. And she's trained by her father to put her hands in the air and to say this if there's a police officer, because her father has been beaten up by the police. And he then starts talking to the camera and he says, "Well, the police stopped me and they split my lip and they did this and they did." And then she starts to cry and cry and cry. And he says, no, it's okay. It's okay. I think it really is a balance, but I think you have to be honest with your children and say to them that racism still exists in this country, and therefore you must behave in a particular way. I've had, I was on a talk show in Chicago, and it was a call-in show. One of the callers said to me, "We have to teach our children to confront the police. They shouldn't acquiesce. They should confront." And my feeling is, the time for confrontation is after you have survived a traffic stop. The time for you come to me, I'll get you a lawyer. We'll take the lawyer to the police station. We will confront after. but you have to survive. If you get stopped on the side of the road, it's just you and that police officer. You have to survive that encounter. The confrontation can come if the police officer does something wrong. Most police officers are good, decent people. The problem is if you encounter that one that's a racist or that's afraid of you because you're Black.
You're echoing something that another one of your participants in the film said, which was your job is to survive. Your job is to survive the encounter, get to a phone, and we'll handle the lawyer, we'll handle all. You just survive so you can get to a phone and call us. Dr. Gretchen Sorin, I have to thank you. Thank you for being on the show. Thank you for making this really important, powerful movie, Driving While Black. It's available on PBS, and your book also available, Driving While Black. It's a powerful film. I really encourage everybody to see it. And thank you, Dr. Sorin, for being here. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks.